should maybe just jump right in. Welcome everybody to the CAB2 Chat and Chew. We call it the CAB2 because it's not our Community Advisory Board one business meeting, but it's the CAB2. It's the open public space where we're trying to bring you content that you're requesting. So please fill out the evaluation at the end to give us more guidance about where you want to see this work and this forum go. The typical format is 20 minutes of talk and then 35 minutes or so of Q&A, which you can do in your chat. You can raise your hand and we'll try to get to everybody's questions. Eva will be gathering questions out of the chat, so we'll be compiling them and trying to organize them to help get as many answers as possible. For those that don't get answered, we ask that our speaker please respond to them in email, so then we can send those answers out to everybody who's on. It's also called the CAB2 because we want all of you to invite 2 people so that we can try to grow this forum exponentially. So once you're kind of signed up with us and you're going to continue to get the notification about our offerings here at the UCSF Helen Diller Family Comprehensive Cancer Center Office of Community Engagement. So without further ado, I would like to introduce our speaker and welcome her into this space. It's going to be really exciting, as I keep saying over and over. I have on the top of your bio introducing Dr. Leticia Márquez-Magaña, and it says rhymes with lasagna. So I think that's a cue that you have given me in the past. It's very helpful. Dr. Magaña is a professor of biology at San Francisco State. She has, I think we've known each other for more than 10 years now. And in all of that time, she's been fully committed and deeply embedded in advancing community engaged transdisciplinary research to achieve health equity. So really centering her research questions on a trajectory that moves us forward rather than simply documents a problem. She's a first-generation college graduate, got her BS and her MS degree in biological sciences at Stanford, and then went on to earn her PhD in biochemistry at UC Berkeley as the first Latina woman to actually ever do so. She's the director of the Health Equity Research Laboratory at SF State, working with her lab personnel on research projects aimed at linking basic science to community health. I love that. That's the holy grail. She's also the lead PI with 8 years of NIH funding on the SFBUILD project, stands for Building Infrastructure Leading to Diversity, where students underrepresented in medicine and STEM fields have the opportunity to earn a master's degree and collaborate in a collaborative training environment that leverages resources both from UCSF and from SF State. And just want to mention that in recognition of her broader efforts to diversify the scientific workforce, she's been awarded a mentor award by the American Association for the Advancement of Science in 2001 and the Bay Area Jefferson Award in 2013. And today she'll be talking about systemic and structural and interpersonal racism and how that can get under our skin and manifest itself in our physiology. So I want to welcome her to the forum. For those of you who are UCSF affiliated, if you wouldn't mind renaming yourself and put a UCSF in parentheses so that we can get a sense of how many are from inside the institution and how many are from outside, that would be really helpful. So I want to turn it over to Dr. Leti. Thank you so much for being with us today. And feel free to share your share screen. You're muted.
Okay, sorry about that. I was all set to go with the sharing the screen. You can all see it, right? Okay, so thank you, Kim, for that introduction and for sharing the tagline for the Health and Equity Research Lab. That's the original tagline. Now we're ground truthing community knowledge through science. We really wanted to foreground the fact that community has a lot of knowledge that scientists are missing out on. And so that's what I'll talk about today is how racism gets under the skin and what community can do about it. Because this, in my mind, we've documented a lot. It's time to look at what we can do to fix things. Okay, so I'm going to start with an interactive activity, and it comes from a recent Twitter feed. And so I'll read it aloud, and then I'm going to ask how this made you feel. So I was recently on a flight to Charlotte, and when the flight landed, 2 women, one black, one white, got into an argument after bumping into one another in the aisle. When they got off the plane, the white woman turned to the black woman, red with anger, and called her the N-word. It had been many years since I heard that word used, sort of unvarnished racism and venom. I was standing next to the black woman as it happened. I was struck by feeling that I had, in an instant, swept over my entire body, cortisol coursing through me, my skin on fire. I bring this up because quite literally, I felt the impact of the moment in my body for hours after it happened. I couldn't shake it. While the venom had not been oriented, you can see just when I read it, it messed me up, had not been oriented directly at me. I experienced the debris of the woman's language in ways that I felt in and under my skin. So I'm going to ask Lori to launch the poll, and I want to see how that tweet affected you. Did you have so she's launching the poll, and so you can click on A, did you have hotter skin? Did you have a faster heartbeat? Did you have chest pain or tightening? Did you feel nauseated, or some or all of the above? And so I don't, there it is. Okay, there was so go ahead and cue in what that tweet experience, what did you experience? And as that's coming, clearly what had happened to me is it caused, I lost train of thought. And that is indicative of a number of hormonal responses. So here we go. There's 67 individuals. So looks like I'll stop it in a minute. So it's 36 seconds, or I'll ask Lori to stop it in a minute. $44. Okay, so 15 more seconds. We have a 65% participation rate. And okay, it looks like that'll do it. So it looks like the majority of the participants of this webinar had some or all of those outcomes, physiological outcomes. If you feel so inclined, you can also put them in the chat, recognizing that in the chat they're not anonymous anymore. Okay, so when I was, oftentimes people say, well, how does racism get under the skin? And I'm like, I don't understand why people don't understand the question or why they have the question, because, common sense, we have all known that these kinds of racist interactions have an effect on our biology. So let me move can you close the poll, Lori? Because it's in the middle of okay, here, I can close it. Okay. This is a slide that, the next slide that I use in order to talk about how racism stress affects the body. It's actually stress, but stress is stress. And so what you can see is that it has outcomes on many of the organs of our body. And in particular, my PhD is in biochemistry. I'm really a molecular biologist. I talk about the fact that chronic stress due to social disadvantage can elevate cortisol levels. Anyway, we have some data that says that maybe cortisol dysregulation, not necessarily up and down, but anyway, affects ultimately a series of outcomes that leads to shorter telomeres, and these shorter telomeres can cause premature cellular aging and health disparities. So that's how it gets under the skin. I'm going to unpack what telomeres are and how the external environment gets inside and under our skin, and that's in this slide. And this is many of you have seen this kind of illustration of the social determinants of health. You're in economic and social opportunities, your living and working conditions, and how that affects behaviors and access to medical care, which interacts with biological factors to ultimately determine health outcomes. And so that's how the outside gets in. And in particular, I'm going to be focusing on telomere shortening, which are the protective caps at DNA ends. And so if you think of shoelaces and the plastic caps at the end of them, as those shorten, your shoelaces begin to fray. And that's the same sort of thing that happens with chromosomes. And that can cause premature cellular aging. And I'll show that on the next slide, leading to chronic disease and cancer. So this is the illustration of a chromosome. And so a chromosome is DNA wrapped in a bunch of proteins. And at the ends of these chromosomes, you can see that there's telomeres. And these telomeres normally get shorter. That's a normal process. And so with each cell division, that's what you're seeing here, one cell dividing into two, the telomeres are getting shorter and shorter till they get to what is called a critical length. And that's also shown over here. And so once they get to a critical length, those cells are old and they stop dividing. And so what ends up happening is that some cells are more, division is more required in order to maintain functionality. So when this happens in heart cells, eye cells, cells of the immune system, and in stem cells, which are progenitors, you know, the beginning cells for all the other cell types, they just stop dividing. And so, for example, for me, you know, my eyesight has been bad for a long time because I suspect my telomeres, they shorten all over the place, but it's been very susceptible that my eyes are not regenerating. Okay, so that's why I showed this the cells dying. And that's what is shown here in normal cell progression. You can see that there's a young cell, the telomeres are long, the aging cell, the telomeres are getting shorter. And then in the dying cell, the telomeres have reached a critical length. It gets easily confused because there's a paradox. While shortening of telomeres can lead to advanced biological aging, cell death, and some of the chronic diseases, increasing telomere length can lead to cancer. And so what happens is in cancer cells, you have the normal shortening of the telomeres, but something happens that our bodies try to compensate with telomerase. Telomerase is the protein in the body, the enzyme that puts back the DNA ends at the end. And so, but it gets overactivated. And so then you end up having longer telomeres and you progress to cancer. So in a nutshell, things that happen out in the environment, whether you have diminished opportunities because of discrimination due to your race, whether you live in poor communities and with a greater burden of environmental injustice because you don't make a whole lot of money, which affects both your behaviors and your medical care, ultimately can impinge upon your telomere length and a bunch of other things to affect health. And so I'm focusing on telomeres because that's what we've been using in our research lab, in the Health and Equity Research Lab, the HER lab. So to make that more clear, there are two types of aging. There's chronological aging, which you're 1 year, you're 5 years old, you're 10 years old, you're 75 years old, right? But then there's cellular aging. And cellular aging is the telomere length. And so what can happen is if telomeres are shorter when you're younger, your body is out of sync with the chronological age. So how can you have premature cellular aging? Well, we're looking at in collaboration with Kendra Watson, who was a graduate student at UCLA. He looked at Black men. He looked at Black men at UCLA who reported racial microaggressions. And what he, in collaboration with us, found is that the telomere length of the men, and here they're represented in a series of dots, ranged from a length of 0.3, and I'm just gonna, it's relative telomere length, but just from this arbitrary measure in terms of the relative telomere length, it's from 0.3 up to 2.0. And that was a big surprise for me. I thought it was more like this. There was more of a 1-to-1 correlation, but I was wrong, especially in younger ages. Because these individuals are 22 years old, and we looked at 42 of them. And one of the students was actually the only one in a biology course, in the biology major at UCLA. He was he was a Black man who was the only individual to graduate from the biology program, undergraduate biology program in 2018. And his telomere length is down in here. And his story is in If These Cells Could Talk. It's a Vimeo that we can share afterwards. Okay, so the point is that there's a range of telomere lengths in these individuals. As it turns out, there was correlations to the number of racial microaggressions that were reported, but it was also about the coping with it. Okay, so individuals who their parents had told them, you're likely to go into UCLA and experience something different from other individuals who don't have Black skin. And, these are some tools that you might use. Their telomere length was longer than the folks who were told by their parents and by society, you just have to work harder. And so that's how we see this. But the thing that's surprising is that the telomere lengths are comparable to breast cancer survivors, that we measured the telomere lengths in a different study of multi-ethnic breast cancer survivors. So this is white, Asian, Chinese, Black, and Latino women. And these are the telomere lengths of 63, and their average age is 61. So the take-home message here is these individuals are 3 times as old as the younger individuals, and yet their telomere lengths are pretty comparable, which is just so disturbing. I remember crying the first time I saw this result. So why is it that it's not chronological? Why isn't it the one-to-one? Well, because telomere length is subject to a number of factors. For example, a lot of studies have looked at the mothers of chronically ill children, and their telomeres are really short. But looking at racial discrimination is something that's beginning to be looked at in terms of telomere biology research. But these are the factors that were in the paper that we published in terms of self-reported racial discrimination and telomere length. That was the main thing that we looked at. But you can see that there's a number of social determinants and structural determinants and behaviors, and they can affect, that can impact this relationship. And what we looked at in particular, and I'll show you the transdisciplinary team in the next slide, is the racial discrimination and telomere length in African-American women who were in midlife, and in particular looking at educational attainment and employment status. Okay, so before I go on, I wanted to acknowledge the individuals that are part of this transdisciplinary team. So this is myself and Rebecca, who were in the Health and Equity Research Lab. We've got our lab coats on because we're sitting right next to the qPCR machine that's used to do the telomere length measurements. Saba, who was a graduate of the Health and Equity, her lab, was also a member of the Hearts Research Group over at UC Berkeley. And that group is led by Amani, used to be Neurojeter, now Amani Allen. And we published with Marilyn Thomas, who is an alumni of San Francisco State and who's over right now at UCSF, and Eli Michaels, I think, was also in that paper. And so what did we look at? The research question that we wanted to investigate: is there a difference in the relationship between everyday discrimination, interpersonal one, and I'll show a slide on that, and telomere length? And is there a relationship with experiences of discrimination at the institutional level and TL? So what's the difference between interpersonal and institutional? Interpersonal is between people. And so this is an example of that. Institutional has to do with the structures that limit access to the playing field, so you can see the editorial comments here. Or you can get rid of the whole barriers. So this is the institutional, is the barriers, and the interpersonal is the communication between folks. And we looked at that in the cohort of the participants that we looked at their reported and biomarkers, and then looked at telomere length. So this is a study that was of 140 Black female participants. Their average age is almost 42. In terms of the federal definition of poverty, 100% of households were below the threshold, and 20% were above the threshold. We all know that poverty measures are a little whack, whatever. Anyway, the education, we saw that 66% of them had more than high school, 33% of them had less than high school, and in terms of the employment status, it's about half in each bucket. When we looked at reported interpersonal racism and discrimination, this is the measure that we used, or these are the items on the measure that we used. These are the questions that we asked the participants in terms of in your day-to-day life, how often do any of the following things happen to you because of your race, ethnicity, or skin color? And so we captured levels of agreement with these statements via a survey. And we also looked at institutional racism and have you ever been treated unfairly, judged differently than others, prevented from doing something, or been hassled or made to feel inferior in any of the following situations because of your race, ethnicity, or skin color? And so again, we measured the level of agreement with these statements as an overall measure of institutional racism discrimination. So what are our findings? I'm just focused, you can go ahead and read the paper, but I'm just going to go over the key findings because they generate discussion points for this group. First of all, there was a distribution of telomere length measurements. There were very short telomere length, and that's about 11%. 75% were in the medium range, and 14% were in the long. And I can tell you how we made those decisions about what short, medium, and long is, but just to point out that they're short, medium, and long. Then we looked at this as an outcome of exposure to racism and discrimination. And I'm not sure that that's the way the epidemiologists would say it. Maybe they would say it as the predictor, but I'm talking about exposure to racism and discrimination and how it affects your telomere length. And what we found is no significant association. And these are the tables that Amani in Maryland created. And I'm not going to elaborate what they mean, but basically there's no stars here or asterisks. Once there's an asterisk next to a number, it means that it's significant. And so what we found, no significant association between the reported interpersonal racial discrimination and telomere length. Nonetheless, we did find it when it was a structural or when it was institutional racism. And the two significant findings were that telomere lengths were longer in individuals who had greater than a high school diploma. That's pretty much keeping with the idea in a lot of medical research that the more education you get, the better off you are, maybe the more wealth you have, and then wealth equals health. Not in alignment with that paradigm is the fact that we found that telomere length was longer in those who were not employed. Okay, so not employed. And that for a while we were like, well, how do we explain that? And so I had been reading a Time article and it talks about racism and discrimination in the workplace. And I've read this book by Ruth Enid Sembrana about the toxic ivory towers, which I experienced. You know, the kinds of things that those of us who are the one only, one of the few, the minoritized experience in the workplace. And so when I think of this result, the latter result, I think, well, gosh, most folks have greater than a high school diploma. They probably have a job that has unemployment insurance. And so when they're unemployed, they're getting unemployment insurance, and then they don't have to be in the toxic environment of the workplace. So that is how I explain the second result. And so what I'm going to do is then share, this is the data that we collected. I'm going to share additional data that talks about, you know, can we begin to think about how to grow our telomeres, how to address the fact that racial discrimination does shorten them. And it's from the work of others. And so this is the work from Geronimus's group over in Detroit, Michigan. And so again, I said that the paradigm is wealth equals health. Well, if you look at whites, you can see, so what they looked at is in Detroit, Michigan, they looked at white, black, and what they call Mexican populations. And I'm like, well, you know, if I was a reviewer on that paper, I would have said US Mexicans, or I don't know what I would have said. I don't know that, anyway, it just seemed odd that that's the title at the bottom of the bar, but okay. So, but if you look at the whites in this group, and it's non-poor versus poor. So, because apparently there aren't any rich folks in their data set. So if you look at whites, and if you look at, you can see that non-poor versus poor, it's in alignment with this paradigm of wealth equals health, okay? If you look at blacks, basically there's no statistically significant difference between being non-poor or being poor. And this reminds me of the results that show that for prostate cancer, it doesn't matter if you're a rich Black man or a poor Black man, prostate cancer is high for both groups. So it's outside of the, well, it's high in both groups. So it's outside of whether you have money or not, it's more the color of your skin. Okay. And then if I look at what I call the US Mexicans, it's anti-paradigmatic. What you can see is that the non-poor Latinos have Mexicans, okay, I'm just gonna go by what she says, have shorter telomeres than the ones that are poor. So there's a number of ways to explain this. One is the immigrant paradox, you know, that perhaps the folks who are poor are more recent residents of our country. I actually think it's the social cohesion, and I'll show that in the end, is that my parents are Mexican immigrants. We grew up in Sacramento, California. My dad is a construction worker. My mom didn't work for a while, but then canned fish and was a housekeeper and a nanny. I don't know if we were poor or non-poor, but we were certainly in that environment. I was poorer financially than I am now. Nonetheless, I was richer in my community. You know, somebody came to knock on the door, they were totally welcomed in. I was very connected to the local community. You know, here I live in Pacifica in a beautiful home, but I don't even know my neighbors. And so I think that one of the ways to explain the longer telomere length of the non-poor Mexicans in Detroit, Michigan, is that they have a greater connection to one another, multi-generational homes, all that sort of thing. Okay, so this is another study that suggests that it's, you know, maybe having place-based social cohesion. So this is a study that was done by Warner and Gomez. So Gomez is now a member of y'all's research investigators over at UCSF. And it's looking at the impact of neighborhood racial composition or segregation and breast cancer outcomes. And so it's a little bit hard to read this table, but basically what they looked at is the levels of segregation. So low segregation means that it's pretty mixed community, and low percent Black, that's clear. So high segregation would mean, you know, in this case, a mostly Black community with high percent Black. And what you can see is that the lowest hazard ratio, so the lower the hazard ratio, the better you are. So it's the lower the rate, the lower the way I think of it, it's the lower risk for having breast cancer. Okay, so what you can see that the best situation for non-Hispanic African Americans is in highly segregated communities with with high percent Black. Interestingly enough, that also is good for the non-Hispanic whites in that community. So the strength of the Black culture in those highly segregated communities is likely in the social cohesion driving this lower hazard rate. And then when non-Hispanic whites are integrated there, it seems that also helps them out too. So I'm just going to leave that alone because there's other things that we can draw from this. But I think that we said, what can we do about it? Well, we can make sure that we maintain our community connections. So in summary, racism stress contributes to accelerated aging, and that accelerated aging can lead to chronic disease and cancer. The study that I presented from our collaboration is that if you have a high school degree, it does protect you against the harmful effects of institutional racism in terms of telomere length, and your telomeres are longer. And that's the same is true for unemployment. Unemployment does protect your telomeres once you have, in my mind, a high school education and have unemployment insurance. And finally, social cohesion or extreme segregation can protect against telomere shortening. And in the end, I'm going back to this case study because one of the tweets that the tweets that was in the thread is that this individual said, the Black woman and I both looked at one another as the white women rushed off in the crowd after realizing others had hurt her. I'm just looked at one another because what I will say is in graduate school, as Kim mentioned, I was the first Latina, I'm the first and only Latina to get a biochemistry PhD because the program doesn't exist anymore. But I was in my lab and two white women came to me and I felt ambushed, and they spent 2 hours convincing me that it was as hard for a white woman as it was for a minority in the sciences. And I kept saying, well, what about this and what about that? And in the end, the only way I could get this is how I felt, a way, was to say, okay, you're right. It's just as hard for a white woman as it is for myself, who's a woman of color. And I just felt horrible, but I just walked outside and Derek Brazil was there. Derek Brazil is a Black man who I had recruited to the graduate program. All I said to him was, Derek, it's different for us, right? And he just looked me in the eye and he said, of course. And I swear all of the stuff that had gotten under my skin just was released. And so again, social cohesion, having the validation can let go some of these underpinnings, these things, the drive, what gets under the skin to cause you to be unhealthy. And so this is funded by a grant to her lab. The Health Equity Research Lab is funded by a grant from the Common Fund, and Saba, who was the investigator that crossed both San Francisco State and UC Berkeley, was funded by a training grant, the NIH and VRS grant. So I'm right at the 20-minute mark, and so I'm going to stop and open it to question and answers.
Well, thank you so much for that. And I can't see the full screen, but I imagine there's some virtual clapping happening for, asking a real question about how these things impact us on a very physical basis. I'm going to open with one question. We have one question in the chat so far, and I see one hand up. I wanted to ask if social cohesion, which in some models here equal segregation, right, have a positive impact on telomere length. My question is segregation the way forward? And I raise this because in segregated hospitals, when you look at where, who is being served by different hospitals, when you have deep segregation by race ethnicity, actually the outcomes get worse for some populations. So my question is, how do you balance that tension of physiologically, it's good to have, it appears to be good to have that validation around you, but then from the perspective of care delivery, the impacts are the opposite.
Yeah, and I think what's hard there is that in those types of hospitals, which I know your research, there's less resources, right? I mean, I was a Stanford student. I would go into the Stanford Medical Center on a regular basis because I was a postdoc there, and I was just like, wow, okay. And I go to East Palo Alto, and I'm like, whole different thing. Okay, I think back to, I don't know that segregation is the way forward, but I do know that educational outcomes were stronger in Black schools when it was, Black schools with Black teachers and Black community, and then it got desegregated. And the thing is the teachers didn't get moved around. And so, it's a complicated question. But I think the answer is that there is benefits to having connections to your community. And whether those, my connections are sometimes virtual. I go visit my mom in San Jose, I think I've left it vague enough, but I think all of us know how good it feels to be with kin. Right?
And is it, so the follow on, is it good to be with kin, or is it good to be validated in what you're experiencing, which may not be able to happen like you were describing with the women who are in your lab trying to convince you that you're all having the same experience because you're women. So is it the validation? Or
that's a good research question. That is a good research question. And I do know that the critical consciousness scale that was put out by Thomas in 2014 talks about various levels of understanding. And so part of it is understanding that you're part of the oppressed group, but then it's also the agency to do something about it. So I think that, this is a great question. The critical consciousness scale has really been used only in educational environments. I would love to see it used in more of a healthcare setting.
All right, so I saw Shireen had a hand up. I don't know if you took your hand down or not. Shireen, are you still in here?
Michael Shaw has his hand.
Yeah, I see Michael Shaw. I just wanted to make sure that maybe Shireen fell off. So we'll go to Michael Shaw, and then we'll go to some questions oh, you took your hand down. Okay, well, feel free to put your hand back up or put your questions in the chat. Michael Shaw, go ahead and unmute, and let's hear it.
So your fantastic presentation, my sister. I really enjoyed it. Dr.
Thank
Rose,
you.
your question about validation and from someone like you, I think it's both. And I think when it's someone like you, that validation is even more important to you. Now, my question is the opposite. When someone of color is the gatekeeper and you feel more stress when they're the gatekeeper of that racist institution and you feel like they are presenting that to you. And they may be of the same race and ethnicity. I think you feel even more stress. What do you say?
I think maybe that's perceptions, and for me, I always think hurt creates hurt creates hurt people.
Hurt people hurt people.
Hurt people hurt, yeah, okay. So I'm a lot more compassionate when it's another BIPOC. And because I'm like, okay, where did they get those behaviors? You know, for me, it's like, oh, the dominant white majority. That's what my answer is in my head. I don't know that that's true, but so for me, it's easier because I'm more compassionate because I feel, I'm thinking about, but I mean, I think everyone experiences those things differently.
Thank you. I see Catherine has her hand up. You want to unmute, Catherine?
Yes, thanks. I had put my question in the chat, but I wanted to go ahead and ask it. When you had up the graph about the telomere length for the different racial ethnic groups, and with Mexican immigrants, the poorer people are, doing better in their telomere length. And I was wondering if that might be due to, more of an living and perhaps working more in ethnic enclaves. Because I know that my stepmom, when she got out of college and started working in a very white place, she started experiencing so much more discrimination than she had when she was in San Antonio, surrounded by her family and community.
Yeah, so when I was an undergraduate at Stanford, there was a lot of students who came from San Antonio. And they were telling me about the mayor was Latino and everybody was Latino, and they just didn't understand this Chicanismo, the whole Chicano movement. And I was like, well, how can you not understand it? I'm like, and then I'm like, oh, that's a whole different place. It's so ethnic enclave. I love that. But I saw Gila also talked about in the chat about integrating into a burning house. And that's something attributed to MLK, which I didn't know necessarily but that makes sense. So, if you're going into an environment, and even if it's a luxurious mansion, if it's on fire, that's not good for you. So maybe going back to Kim's question, it's like, yeah. So yeah, I think that it could be the ethnic enclaves. I mean, the thing is also there's just stress that comes to not being able to find the tortillas that you want and the nopales. I mean, my brother was at Harvard for a period of time, and we would have to mail him tortillas, because, and it was a big stressor for him. So, I don't want to trivialize it, but certainly there are benefits to being with others that that you feel good around.
I see another hand up. It's Nazrat, but I wanted to, as Nazrat is unmuting, I just wanted to share that when I lived in Boston, I had a hard time finding what I wanted from the grocery store. They're not traditionally African-American foods, but I eat a lot of, influences of food from Mexico because I grew up in San Diego. I mean, that's just, and I remember shopping in one of the big, the Stop and Shop, and having somebody say to me, "You're not from around here, are you?" Just based on what I was asking for. So yeah, not to trivialize the tortilla delivery. I mean, I think it's critically important to feel like you belong somewhere, and that I was being called out, like, you're other, you are not from here. And I wonder if that's really at the root of all of this, is like being otherized effectively. Nasrat, do you want to unmute?
Sure. Can everybody hear me?
Yep.
All right, thank you very much. It was a very nice presentation, and I've been following this for over a decade now. Discrimination, sexual harassment, and all these subjects are things that I've been following and learning and teaching and training for the past decade. But today's presentation was quite unique. So congratulations on the great work. One of the things that I would like to mention is somebody went to the doctor. Let me start with this. Somebody went to the doctor and he said, well, wherever I place my index finger, that part of my body hurts, regardless of where I place it. So the doctor, I examined him and later found out that he had broken his index finger. So the rest of his body was fine. I think when it comes to race and discrimination, one of the main things that I see and I would like to address this is, we say white and the people of color. So my question is, isn't white a color itself? Like when we teach color to kids, don't we say that, these are the colors, okay, white, black, and so why? I think one of the things that from my perspective, that we can do in order to achieve equality is maybe start from here. Stop calling it white and people of color and calling it, white and the rest of it. So that's one thing that I would like to pick your brains on and see what you think of it. Thank you.
So the problem with that is that it fails to acknowledge the root cause. So the root cause is anti-Blackness. I mean, since 400 BC, there's evidence that in order to organize society, to make it easier for people to understand their reality, white was at the top and black is at the bottom. And so that is in literature, in art, it's pervasive. And so if we stop naming the problem, as y'all know, as UCSFers, you can't diagnose it. And so the problem is anti-Blackness, and we need to, and that's diagnosed by the color of your skin. I mean, in other words, in my opinion, it just wouldn't work at all. And I think that what happens is, this color blindness, and the color blindness is just so bad. It's just so bad. I mean, I Kim and I have had these discussions, and I'll just leave it at that.
Well, the color blindness leaves us to default to the status quo. That's the problem. Because if you just step back, don't put any colors on the status quo, just say, okay, ask a question about the status quo. Are we doing well in terms of equity? Not just by race, ethnicity, but by gender, by wealth, right? Are we doing well? Are people doing generally well with that? No, the status quo creates these divisions. So some people are poor, a lot of people are really rich, some people are low on the totem pole based on whatever, color, gender, how short you are, how aggressive as a man you are. So what we have is a problem of otherization, and it's baked into the status quo. So that we can't, I don't think we can stay with the status quo and make it okay and say it's all okay now, because the status quo has gotten us to having to have these conversations, even post civil rights movement.
I just think it's important to explain to the police when you run a red light that I didn't see any color. Just try that and see how it works.
I'm not sure that that's what I meant, but basically when you say white and the people of color, aren't you basically making a distinction that should not be there? Aren't you saying that people of color?
We're all humans, that's for sure. I mean, I can tell you that your genetic sequence is 99.99% identical to mine and to Arnold's and to, Bob's. I'm choosing different people of different phenotypes. So the racial concept is not biological. And, that's what the unveiling of the Human Genome Project, they said there's no genetic evidence or no scientific evidence for the concept of race. Nonetheless, the way society is organized is anti-Black. And so the thing is if that is the way that organizes society, and we want to push that away, we have to have those discussions, and so that people can see the fallacy in their notions. And okay,
and how that drives a whole lot of kind of the way resources are distributed, the access that people have to different things, the benefit of the doubt that you do or do not get when you run that red light or when you're speeding. I want to get Juanita because I accidentally put your hand down. So I know you were waiting to ask a question. Juanita, you're muted.
I'm sorry, Dr. Rowe. You kind of answered halfway. I'm going to kind of stir this pot up a little bit because we're always talking about racism among other colors, but what about racism within your own race? And people are judging. And the reason I bring that up is because I just experienced something recently, like within a week. I told this individual, I said, oh, I'm going to go and buy you lunch. And I was going to buy them some Mexican food. He told me, I don't want that food. It's not from my country. He said, they don't put the love in it. So what do you do when you have racism upon racism within your own culture?
Yeah, I mean, what's hard is that, maybe they didn't like the food because they don't like the food. I don't know if it's a racist thing, but, but you experienced it that way. I mean, I think, I do give talks on how to convert microaggressions to microaffirmations. And so that could have been a microaggression, is to clarify, and you could just say, oh, what do you mean by that? Right. And if it's maybe, because they didn't make it with love, what do you mean by that? And maybe they're just thinking, maybe they're uninformed, right? Or is it really that they're saying that, Mexicans don't make food with love, which I would say, based on my experience, the majority of us do, but, Mexican American, Latina. Anyway, so, but you say within, the thing that my son says, which he educated me, my students and my sons have educated me so much, is that I can't be racist to whites because whites are the dominant majority. But I can be racist to other oppressed groups. And so I think when that happens, maybe it's up to me, and it has been up to me to say, well, is that behavior that can lift us all? Just to say, can you explain what you're meaning by that? Because sometimes I hear it wrong or interpret it wrong. And then if it's clear that then I'll say, how do we lift us all? But I'm not as smooth as other people. I'm like, I watched Arnold navigate these kinds of things, and I've learned a lot from Arnold and from others, but it's maybe this is something we should be training folks in.
No, I think what it is, and I just bring it down, it's like any of us, and we all have a kind of like racism within ourselves when we're talking about food, because it's not the way your mother made it. It's not the way you grew up with. So when you're tasting that, automatically they're saying, this is not like the way I was raised. That's all they're saying. The food is not the way, it doesn't taste the way I was raised on, but the way my mother or grandmother, the way they do it. So that simply is that. Is what they're saying.
And which is a form of otherization, right?
Right.
It standardizes the thing that is mine.
Right.
I'm the standard, and
Thank
whatever
you.
is wrong is wrong. And I think that allows you to really think about this in so many different dimensions and not just race. Right? Who's getting otherized in the situation? Who's being held as the natural standard in the situation? And it just so happens that in America, it happens to mostly, the standards tend to be around white race. So I think now we're having these conversations and starting to need to step back and say, why would that be the standard? Actually, we don't know, except for the history of the country. So there's two questions that got, I think, put in the chat. Number one, we have a question about wondering if there is research that simultaneously looks at behavioral epigenetics and telomere length. And I'm not sure what is meant by behavioral epigenetics, but maybe it's actually just behaviors.
That's a good question. I don't know of research looking at behaviors. I know of research looking at perceptions of others' behaviors, which is, racial, your perception of being discriminated against and that sort of thing. I see Marilyn's on here. She could answer that question.
So I asked the question.
Okay.
Barbara?
Yeah, hi, everybody. So I asked the question because it seems like there aren't many protective factors when it comes to Black African Americans, and not just in terms of telomere length, but in terms of other things too. And I'm going back to that graph that showed the different racial groups, and that Blacks, African Americans, no matter whether they were poor or not poor, I think that was the indicator, is that they are the group that sort of stays the same no matter. And so I know a little bit about epigenetics, and we carry a lot of things in our bodies, and behaviors are passed down. And so I'm wondering if behaviors that have been with us for so long because of slavery, oppression, all of these things that aren't necessarily positive behaviors, and I'm not blaming, because things happen for a reason. So are those behaviors that have been with us for a long, long time, have they also, how do they impact our telomere length? So even behaviors that are things that are not happening to us right now, but happened to us in the past and got passed down. So that's the reason for that question. And also it's because we don't seem to have a lot of things that protect us. So thank you. If anybody can answer it or.
So I think that what can protect us is understanding that it's not our limitations that is limiting our ability to thrive in the US.
I agree.
And that's critical consciousness. Okay, so it's not us, it's the systems. It was designed to keep us down. And so if we can share that with others, and I don't know, when I'm in, I just see Kim and I see Marilyn, and when I'm with Arnold, when I'm in these communities, I feel good, and I'm like, my telomeres are growing. And then I'm in other environments, like in the retention, tenure, and promotion committee. We've been, oh my God, I'm like, really? Anyway, so I can't say anything about what happens in the RTP, but I was just like, okay, that data for that candidate who, is the same data as for this candidate, but somehow that candidate is worse. And then I just leave and I know my telomeres are shortened. So, but I saw you come off camera, Marilyn. Do you want to, you've done a deeper dive on this.
Yeah, hello everyone. Sorry, yeah, I came off camera just because I was eating during the presentation and nobody needed to see that. But hello everyone. Yeah, I co-authored a few papers with Letty regarding this telomeres. And what I could say about the behavioral stuff, to your point, is that yes, there are some health behaviors that are more harmful than helpful, not health promoting, that we have used intergenerationally to cope, right, with systemic racism and interpersonal racism, and also our internalized racism. And some of those coping behaviors are more harmful, but there's others that seem like they would be harmful, but when we do a deeper dive into the analysis, we see that some of it is actually health protective. For example, I was blowing up the chat with little comments, in part because I'm kind of sharing some of the research that we've done in showing that just acknowledging racism, just acknowledging it as systemic, is actually protective. And you would think that maybe acknowledging racism as systemic might be harmful for African American people or Black people, but it's actually not, because it actually counters that internalized racism that we were talking about earlier, which is that when something happens, like Arnold said, we get pulled over by a police officer. Internalize, if you were to internalize that, you could see that as, oh, I did something wrong. I'm doing something wrong. I'm being attacked. I need to do better. It's a flaw in me, versus, oh, I'm getting pulled over because I'm Black and they just pull Black people over around here. Now, the actual appraisal, the stress appraisal of that interaction of racism, perhaps, is, because it's not always racism, but if you internalize it, that has a very different biological response than if you acknowledge it as, oh, it's not me, it's the system. So I'm not going to embody this. I'm not going to hold on to it. I'm going to let it go as soon as they let me go. So yes, there are some behaviors that we would think are harmful and not protective, but we need to do a better job at finding those mechanisms. What are those intergenerational stress coping responses that actually do serve us well versus don't?
Well, thank you very much, everybody. This has been a very, I think, passionate. I definitely know, like, I'm feeling physiologically like some different kinds of things as we're getting into the discussion. So I think it's really just important to be aware, regardless of what race or gender you are, to understand that your environment is impacting your physiology. And to really attend to that. So thank you, everybody. Thank you, Dr. Leti, for bringing us this very stimulating and provocative research and conversation. Really appreciate you. This video will be available on our website. I did put the link in the chat, but if you go to the UCSF Cancer Center website, click on community engagement or search for community engagement, you'll see it in our archived offerings. Please share it out with folks. We want this information to get out. We want people to be having conversation about these critically important issues. Please fill out our survey before you go so that we can bring you the content that you would like to see next quarter, and so in 3 months from now. Please invite 2 people the next time you come. CAB2 Chat and Chew out. Thanks, everybody.